foreign, predatory, parasitic corporations are replacing our natural environment with an industrial landscape of wind turbines. One Nation will stand against sending children down a path of drug dependency and body mutilation to appease the gender cult. Leave our kids alone. The Trusted Digital Identity Bill is a global surveillance and control mechanism that profit-hungry corporations and power-mad politicians drafted and crafted. One Nation opposes this inhuman, dystopian future that the United Nations promotes as the Great Reset, and we condemn this Parliament for signing on to it. I call for Australia to reject the World Economic Forum's Great Reset and instead mount a great resist. Just like the koalas being euthanized to make way for wind turbines, or damaged solar panels leaking toxic heavy metals into waterways, the United Nations net zero plan again involves killing the environment to save it. I've been speaking about the fear, the oppression and the inhuman cruelty of our COVID response since July 2020. I promised to hound down those responsible, and I will continue relentlessly to keep that promise. You're about to be live with me, Senator Malcolm Roberts. Well, g'day. It's a pretty sombre topic we're discussing today. It's the death of democracy in Australia if we don't stand up. I'm going to be talking about specifically giving you a major breakdown of a bill that's just been introduced into the lower house and federal parliament. Communications Legislation Amendment, Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill 2024. The title is a lie. It's a censorship bill. That's it. Freedom of speech is the first freedom, and it's essential to human progress. Absolutely essential to human progress. Someone comes up with an idea, shares it with someone else, someone else then puts a team around it and build an idea out of it for meeting people's needs and meeting new needs. And next thing we have human progress, going ahead in leaps and bounds. Humans are wonderfully caring, have the ability to reason and are loving. Where we shine though is in our communication. The communication of feelings, the communication of thoughts, the communication of fears, the communication of concepts, the communication of people working together. That's what really shines with humans. And that's fundamental to human progress. Of course, you can argue the first real freedom is freedom of life, freedom to live. But given that, once that's in place, the most important freedom is freedom of speech. Now, this Misinformation Disinformation Bill was introduced by the Liberal Nationals coalition government under Scott Morrison and David Littleproud. And it was done by Paul Fletcher, the Minister for Communications at the time. It was done a few years ago. One Nation came out strongly against it immediately, vigorously, and persistently, and we woke up other people about it. We made speeches, videos, Senate speeches. Some of our videos went around the world. We held a free speech conference in Brisbane, in the City Hall here in Brisbane. We had noted prominent media people and politicians talking about the importance of free speech. Very well attended. It was a sellout. It's completely sold out. The house was packed. We've introduced a bill into Parliament to protect free speech. And I want to point out that the Liberal Labor Party, Uni Party, have introduced the digital ID, the identity verification bill, the misinformation, disinformation bill. Pardon my voice, I've just got over a cold. When you combine the misinformation, disinformation bill with the digital ID, it's terrifying. The combination was designed to work like that, and it is terrifying what they can do. So getting back to the misinformation, disinformation bill alone, I'll go through some key provisions, and you decide for yourself. This bill gives powers to ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, to decide what is misinformation and disinformation, and to require social media to take down that content or be fined or blocked in Australia. That's what it's doing. It's getting the government is getting the media platforms, the social media platforms, to do its dirty work. And this completely destroys something that is fundamental to human progress, something that is fundamental to human civilization. It destroys the notion that the truth's best defense is truth. The truth does not need to be defended. It always comes to the fore with debate. It also continues the Safety Commissar's powers to censor individual posts. That's enshrined. What this does not, however, extend to, so it doesn't, Misinformation Disinformation Bill doesn't bring anything new up for one specific post. The E-Safety Commissar, Julie Inman Grant, an American, appointed by Malcolm Turnbull's Liberal Nationals government, already has that power under the Online Safety Act of 2021. So in this bill, who's the censor? The government. Unambiguously, it's the government. The Australian Communication and Media Authority are just a government department who are required to act under instructions from the minister. Nothing in this bill establishes ACMA's autonomy around these powers. So when people say it's the government censoring the media, it bloody well is. It is the government censoring the media, censoring individuals. This legislation adds more structure around the whole process of regulating censoring the internet and leaves Julie Inman Grant's current powers intact, but extends them. So if a site is published an offending post, the E-Safety Commissioner can order it taken down and ban if it isn't, and fine or ban if it isn't. But now these go to additional powers. This disinformation bill goes to additional powers. These powers sit on top of that, they're already given to the Safety Commissar, and allow deeper regulation, requiring sites to have internal controls on disinformation, reporting on taking steps to stop it, and allow for one company to be fined or banned for repeated infringements, even if they act on each one of those posts. So they can do all the censoring and still be acted upon. So you can see how the government is terrifying social media platforms here to become willing complicits, or unwilling but complicit. The bill is designed to stop the material being shared at all, because once Julie Inman Grant has stepped in, it's too late. Material is being shared widely, even in a few minutes of being posted. So she's always just too late to stop it. I'm watching your comments. So she's always too late to stop it. This penalises any company that does not have technology to identify and ban misinformation in real time. AI. So if you don't have AI, tough. In practice, this is what will happen. Realistically, it will probably shut down small sites that can't afford AI and human moderators to act as on an AI warning. Excuse me. This will consolidate social media, comments programs like Discus, search engines and bulletin boards into just a few deep key players under entities the world's predatory billionaires already own. As expected, since they're the ones trying to stifle dissent and ones trying to benefit from dissent. Excuse me. It's going to get wearing, isn't it? It shows, what's more, something that people didn't expect, but the truth is out there. These parasitic billionaires dictate to the government what laws they want and don't want, and the government complies. That's what's driving this. As I said in the introduction, combined with digital ID, this is a real nightmare. Most likely it will give rise to a social credit score when you combine those two, with miscreants banned from posting, sharing, or liking. It really doesn't work any other way. That's what they want. Preventing the person posting is the easiest, most effective way to prevent the post. So you shut down this, you get the social media platform to take down people who don't comply, and that's it. They can't post in the future. There are provisions for the public to report content, and to make complaints about content being or not being dealt with. And it says it may not do so in this framework, which would allow appeal against ACMA ruling may not be implemented. So there's very little in the way of a ruling here, an appeal against a ruling from ACMA. It's needlessly complex. Nothing would stop disputes going to court, and that's highly likely. This bill is a lawyer's feast, a lawyer's picnic, a lawyer's paradise. Oh, and you probably heard already, banks are excluded, health provisions are excluded. In the application provisions, the banking sector is covered to prevent discussion of a bail-in until the bail-in happens. See what they want? They want access to your money, take your money and give it to the bank to give a bail-in because the bank has got into trouble through its own bad management. And the next virus attack is protected, because none of this ivermectin is better or it doesn't stop transmission. You won't be able to say that. So ivermectin we know is far better with COVID. We know it did stop transmission. Everywhere it was used properly, it stopped transmission immediately. It was a prophylactic. It stopped the transmission of the disease. And next virus, you won't be able to say that. You won't be able to tell the truth. And there's no responsibility on government. No responsibility. No accountability. This is the worst thing that can happen to any dictatorial government. And make no mistake, this will be a dictatorial government. There are no penalties for declaring as misinformation something that was not misinformation. There's no ability to go back and sue the government. There is no ability to go back and sue the government. I've checked this with a barrister. There is no ability to go back and sue the government. They can cost you anything, politically, socially, commercially, personally. You can have no redress. No redress against a government that is supposed to serve you. Let's have a look at some slides. Let's see if I can wangle this properly. Can we get the slides up? Here we go. Thank you. This is the bill's front page. Communications Legislation Amendment. Doesn't that sound so innocuous? Sound so timid? Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill. Doesn't that sound so noble? It's the censorship bill. 2024. It was introduced by Morrison, Little Proud Liberal Nationals a few years ago. We came out strongly against it. It's now been introduced into the lower house of federal parliament. It's been sent to a Senate committee for reporting by the end of November. and that means it'll probably not come back until next year. But this is what we've got to be prepared for. Because this government has pulled lots of tricks. There's nothing to stop the government using numbers on the committee with the Greens, as it quite often has, to bring forward the reporting of a committee. Nothing. So let's go on to the next slide. The jurisdiction is outside Australia. The government is reaching out to outside Australia. So the government is taking a power to instruct social media anywhere in the world to comply with this law. While countries with the First Amendment may not comply, freedom of speech, the government will have the power to block or fine that social media in Australia. Let's go to the next one. While the bill talks about social media, it actually uses the phrase digital communication platform. This is a much wider net. It includes a small social websites, community bulletin boards, comments programs like Discus and search engine results. Yes, search engine results. This definition traps any website that is accessible in Australia, even if it's not targeted to Australia. Anything emanating from Australia, even if it's not targeting sites, even if it's not targeting audiences in our country. We'll go to the next one. A digital communication platform does not come under the Act if it does not have an interactive feature. And that's what this talks about, meaning of interactive feature. Basically, if people can't contribute or share the content. The definition is very, very broad, captures almost everything. For the purposes of this schedule, a digital service has an interactive feature if at least one of the following applies to the digital service. A digital service allows an end user to post content on the digital service other than as part of gameplay. Oh, so games are excluded. Isn't that kind of them? You can still play games. Bread and circuses. The digital service provides a means for an end user to share within the digital service and other than as part of gameplay, content that is provided on the digital service with another end user. So if you're sharing with another end user, you're open. You're part of the target. The digital service makes interaction between end users or interaction by end users with content provided on the digital service observable to other end users other than as part of gameplay. Let's go to the next one. So if you're interacting, you're in trouble. Exemptions. The minister may exempt any site he or she wants to exempt. There are no other rules around that. So the minister could exempt donor sites. What that means is the minister has absolute power. They're censorship czar. They take charge of speech. They take charge of communication in this country, literally. Personal communication. Interactive communication. That minister at the moment is Minister Michelle Rowland. She's in the Labor Party, and she's the one who introduced this bill. So that's where the power will be, in the hands of one minister. Let's go to the definition of misinformation. Here we go. Very general wording with no real checks and balances. Just the way a totalitarian dictatorship would want it. It gives the Australian Communication and Media Authority a lot of power, which gives the government a lot of power, because the Australian Communication and Media Authority is simply a government instrumentality. So the government is telling the ACMA, Australian Communications and Media Authority, what to declare censored and what to not censor. That's where the power is. This is a totalitarian dictatorship at work. Meanings of misinformation and disinformation. For the purposes of this schedule, dissemination of content using a digital service is misinformation on the digital service. On the digital service. See how they put them in the firing line? If the content contains information that is reasonably verifiable as false, misleading, or deceptive. In his view, where are the facts? There's no reference to having facts to declare something false. And the content is provided on the digital service to one or more end users in Australia. Excuse me. And the provision of the content on the digital service is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. And the dissemination is not excluded dissemination. So let's talk about harm. Well, we'll talk about that in a little bit. For the purposes of this schedule, dissemination of content using a digital service, I think that's covered on the next slide. No, it's not. It's disinformation now on the digital service if the content contains information that is reasonably verifiable as false, misleading and deceptive. And for the purposes of this schedule, dissemination of content using a digital service is disinformation on the digital service if the content contains information that is reasonably verifiable as false, misleading, or deceptive, and the content is provided on the digital service to one or more end users in Australia, and the provision of the content on the digital service is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm, and the dissemination is not excluded dissemination, so the government hasn't excluded it. And either there are grounds to suspect that the person disseminating or causing the dissemination of the content intends that the content deceive another person, willful deception, or the dissemination involves inauthentic behavior. For the purposes of this schedule, in determining whether the provision of content on a digital service is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm, regard must be had to the following matters: the circumstances in which the content is disseminated, the subject matter of the information in the content that is reasonably verifiable as false, misleading, or deceptive, the potential reach and speed of the dissemination, the author of the information, the purpose of the dissemination, whether the information has been attributed to a source, and if so, the authority of the source and whether the attribution is correct. Other related information disseminated that is reasonably verifiable as false, misleading, or deceptive. Any matter that is determined by the Minister under subclause 4. Any other relevant matter. Pretty big scope, isn't it? Wide. The Minister may, by legislative instrument, determine a matter to which regard must be had in determining whether the provision of content on a digital service is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. The minister can dictate what her totalitarian government wants to do. So, so what we've seen is a definition of disinformation, the same objection. It's subjective, highly subjective, depends upon interpretation by just one or two people. Notice the bottom bit back on my slide number 7. Disinformation may be by a foreign power, meaning foreign country, setting up Russian disinformation and banning Russian websites entirely from Australia, as a guess. The next slide, number 8, showed it set up some ifs and buts, which do not provide any real protections, because the minister can dictate rules to the Australian Australian Communications and Media Authority. These are disallowable, but if ACMA chooses to do the thing themselves without being told, the Senate cannot intervene to make the minister stop them, unless by legislation, like the Blaney Gold Mine Bill. So this is just totalitarianism right here in Australia, coming in a month. If the people don't stand up. For the government to act, there needs to be serious harm involved. This is the definition of serious harm. The arbiter, the decider of what's serious harm, is the Australian Communications and Media Authority. Or the minister can direct it. Again, it comes back to the government. Either the government department or the government that can be controlled by the government or the government itself. The wording is weasel words that could mean anything the Australian Communications and Media Authority wanted it to mean. There's no burden of proof. The Australian Communications and Media Authority doesn't need to prove it. Nothing. No proof. Findings of serious harm are not legislative instruments. The Senate has no oversight of this process. No oversight whatsoever. The definition of serious harm is so broad that it can be interpreted to mean just about anything. And you watch, it will. if the bill goes through. Let's go to slide number 10, exemptions to the bill. Note the government is not specifically excluded, but because the government decides what is misinformation, it's unlikely to declare its own messaging to be misinformation. It's effectively excluded because it's not mentioned. The exemption is for academic purpose. That doesn't automatically let universities off the hook, yet they may claim it does. It prevents you sharing a scientific paper, for instance, critical of the COVID injections, the COVID jabs, because you are sharing it for political, not academic purposes. So if you're not if you're not sharing the supportive academic paper for academic purposes to share between academics, and you're sharing it for political purposes, or purposes of waking people up, that's it. It's out. So academic research doesn't really qualify at all in many regards so far as the people are concerned. See, look at this. For the purpose of this schedule, serious harm is harm to the operation of or integrity of a Commonwealth, state, territory, or local government, electoral or referendum process. What about if the integrity involves exposing a lie from the government? Can't do it. And we've seen that in the discussion over the last few years about this bill that the Liberal Nationals introduced. Secondly, serious harm is harm to public health in Australia, including to the efficacy of preventative health measures in Australia. Including to the efficacy of preventive health measures in Australia. That's COVID all over again. COVID let off the hook. COVID, deceit and lies let off the hook completely. Just giving it an open leash. Can we have that slide back up? Vilification of a group in Australian society distinguished by race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, disability, nationality or national or ethnic origin, or vilification of an individual because of a belief that the individual is a member of such a group. So you can't question anything. Biological sex, females are XX chromosomes, males are XY chromosomes. Stating that would possibly offend some people who think they've changed gender by changing their dress or their costume or putting on makeup if they're men. This is what's going to hurt families. It's what's going to hurt the whole country. It's what's going to hurt the truth. And you know, Christianity, which came from the Middle East, established truth as a very high virtue, and that is going to be smashed. That's why they've been targeting Christianity, because Christianity is the foundation for Western civilization, and they don't want Western civilization's values because they want to destroy Western civilization to put in place old values that are not at all in line with Western civilization and the human race. They want to destroy our society. That serious harm is intentionally inflicted physical injury to an individual or in Australia. Okay, that's fair enough. But we've already got laws protecting people against that. Serious harm is imminent damage to critical infrastructure or disruption of emergency services. That's fine too, but it's already enshrined in our laws. Or imminent harm to the Australian economy, including harm to public confidence in the banking system or financial markets. Don't talk about the banks, otherwise you'll be bringing harm to the country. That's the way the harm is being done by the banks being out of range, out of target, protected by regulations in this country, because you or I can't sue them without a huge wad of cash. And the banks can get away with anything just by digging deeper into their lawyers' pockets and getting more and more lawyers to defend themselves. This will make banking impossible to touch. You can't even speak about them. That is significant. You can't even talk about the economy if they say that your words could be harmful to the economy and cause people to question. I can't read that. Significant and far-reaching consequences for the Australian community, the Australian economy, the Australian government. This ends free speech completely. It ends speech about so many topics in our country. Let's go to the next slide. Meaning of excluded. The definition of news, by the way, is reasonable. It may not prevent spreading a news story that serves your political ends, if it's news. But that's up to the mouthpiece media, that's the globalist own anyway. For the purposes of this schedule, the following are excluded dissemination. Dissemination of content that would reasonably be regarded as parody or satire. So we can have a joke within the definition of the Australian government. Dissemination of professional news content. So the mouthpiece media, the ones that were on side pushing the lies during COVID, the big brother globalist media, they're excluded because they're disseminating it on their official news. Reasonable dissemination of content for any academic, artistic, scientific or religious purpose. The purpose of this schedule, professional news content, is news content produced by a person who produces and publishes online news content in any of the following formats: a newspaper, a magazine, a television program or channel, a radio program or channel, a website or part of a website. What about podcasters? Independent truth media? No, not on there. They can be hammered. And that's where a lot of people were getting the accurate news during the COVID mismanagement and suppression. So it's only the globalist mouthpiece media and the government that is exempt, and academic research, providing you're not sharing it for political purposes. So you can't share the truth for political purposes. You cannot share the truth for political purposes, or you won't be able to. Well, by the way, Section 34 of the bill allows the Australian Communications and Media Authority to obtain information from a third party. So if I post something containing information about some other person, the Australian Communications and Media Authority can require that that person to give them any information they ask. Any information they ask, they're required to do so. The Australian Communication and Media Authority can drag any person in the world into a dispute that may have only mentioned them, their behaviour, or mentioned their research. For example, the Australian Communication and Media Authority can direct a vaccine-injured person to prove their case or have their comments ruled disinformation, even if they didn't share it. Someone else did. That's beyond censorship. You get named even without knowing it, and you may be required to divulge whatever the czars in the Australian Communication and Media Authority want. Remember, it's not them, it's the government propping them up behind them. News content, I missed this one, sorry. Reports, investigates, or explains any of the following. Issues or events that are relevant in engaging persons in public debate and in informing democratic decision making. Current issues or events of public significance for persons at a local, regional, national, or international level. Current issues or events of interest to persons. Only through the mouthpiece media, radio, TV, websites, newspapers, magazines. That's it. No independent podcasters, no Tucker Carlsons, no Joe Rogans. They're not exempt. They're coming in here, they're in trouble. No Elon Musk, no social media. So I'll get to this in a minute. Well, let's do it now. Misinformation standards. Limitation in relation to freedom of political communication. Yes, you read that correctly. Limitation in relation to freedom of political communication. Freedom of speech is not dealt with specifically within our Constitution. Our forefathers, when they were framing the Constitution, just assumed no one would ever remove that. But freedom of political communication is mentioned in the Constitution and protected by the Constitution. You cannot do that. And yet now, let's have a look at that again. The Australian Communication and Media Authority must not determine a standard under this division that deals with one or more matters relating to the operation of digital communications platforms unless the Australian Communication and Media Authority is satisfied that the standard A is reasonably appropriate and adapted to achieving the purpose of providing adequate protection for the Australian community from serious harm caused or contributed to by misinformation or disinformation in the platforms, and goes no further than reasonably necessary to provide protection. An assessment of whether a standard is compatible with human rights must be prepared. Okay. See the weasel words there? Let's have it again. See the weasel words? And goes no further than reasonably necessary to provide that protection. They will decide whether your freedom of political communication is acceptable or not. They will decide. Not the Constitution, not a judge. They will decide. This is above it all. This is terrifying. The bill's provisions specifically limits freedom of political communication. This is a deliberate contradiction of the implied right to political communication in our Constitution. And a barrister, a very good barrister, fine barrister, advises this part is challengeable in the High Court. For those of us who have the money, I don't have the money to go challenging the High Court. So it means essentially that apart from a few instances, and they have to be involved, they won't be challenged. You note the weasel words as I identified. ACMA must not determine, the Australian Communication and Media Authority must not determine a standard that breaches the right to political communication unless it's reasonably necessary. That means go ahead and do it if the government says so. The government is weaseling out and driving social media platforms to do the censoring. That's what this is all about. There's no explicit statement that the Australian Communication and Media Authority decides what is misinformation or disinformation. None. It's all vague. And the vaguer it is, the more of a lawyer's field day it will be. And the more people will be scared to say even the tiniest thing out of order. Or in order, but ruled to be out of order. Because social media platforms and mouthpiece legacy media rely heavily on government funds. It makes them vulnerable to censoring on the government's behalf. They don't dare step out of line because they won't get government support in the form of taxpayer money paying for their government advertising on the platforms and on mouthpiece media. This is a huge threat, a clever yet horrible intent, a designed, clever yet horrible intent by intention. And the government is immune. Distribute as much misinformation, disinformation as the government wants with no repercussions. People won't even know about it. If this was in place in 2020, and they tried to put it in place, not the bill, but provisions that effectively had the same power under Scott Morrison and David Littleproud. If it was in place in 2020, it would have pushed the COVID narrative on treatments. It would have suppressed anything about ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine completely and ruled it as serious harm and disinformation. From disinformation. Serious provisions, penalties. This bill is evil, it is anti-human in its intent, in its foundation, the core. And in its preparation, it is chaotic, as is typical of this government. Last week in the Parliament, even the Greens were saying that the government's new housing legislation would result in an increase in housing prices. Everyone can see it. Crossbenchers, Liberal Party, National Party, Greens, and the Greens and all of us were calling it out. This government has descended into complete chaos. It cannot draft legislation. And then when it stands up and tries to defend itself, it doesn't use facts, data, logic. It uses smears and labels. Labels are the refuge of the ignorant, the incompetent, the stupid, the dishonest, the deceitful, and the fearful. We see the humiliating efforts of Senators Tim Ayres and Murray Watt. All they're doing when they stand up and speak on the government's behalf is ridicule and tell things that are not truthful and use labels. Just smears and labels. That's all they've got. They put a bill into the Senate and they can't even take responsibility for the chaos that comes out of it. So I'm going to summarize now because I want to make sure we get well under the hour, because we'll shut down Instagram if we don't get under the hour. Freedom of speech is the number one trait of democracy. Political and personal communication is absolutely essential for human democracy and for human progress. I want to say to people, we beat the cash ban. We, the people in my office, beat the cash ban. Morrison Littleproud government introduced the cash ban bill into the House of Representatives. The Labor Party and joined the Morrison Littleproud Liberal Nationals and passed it through the lower house. That was their first step in the uni-party Liberal Labor gang's attempt to get cash banned in this country. We got wind of it. We started preparing before it was introduced into the House of Reps. We got the crossbench on board. My office did this with the help of Pauline's office. We got the crossbench on board, alerted them to it. Then we went to the Labor Party and realised they were weak. And they still are in government. And then we went to the grassroots members of both the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, and they took it from there. They stood up and they sent very strong letters telling the members of Parliament, members of the Senate, Liberal and Labor, to not vote for this thing. The cash ban bill was consigned to a committee, and it stayed there for months and months and months. And then I moved a motion in the Senate to get it off the Senate books, and my motion got up. Some people credit me with that. I don't. I credit the grassroots members and Australians who pressured Liberal Labor members of Parliament to do their bloody job and look after the people of this country. We did the same with the UN World Health Organization Pandemic Treaty and International Health Regulations. In this country, we got the people to realise, to wake up. We did the same with the Financial Services Royal Commission. 16 times as Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull said there will be no Financial Services Royal Commission. 26 times, Scott Morrison, as Treasurer under Malcolm Turnbull, said there will be no Royal Commission. Pauline negotiated a Senate Select Inquiry into lending to primary production customers, that's farmers, fishermen, and foresters. And my office, along with some of Pauline's staff, went out into the bush and we helped farmers make submissions, guided them in making submissions. They made submissions to the Senate Select Inquiry. We then got those submissions, we read them, we got the witnesses, and we got the witnesses in the bush. Charters Towers, Roma, Perth, representing a lot of people from the bush in Western Australia. We got the farmers, we got the fishermen, we got the foresters, and we got their horrible stories of deceitful, dishonest, criminal behaviour out into the open. And then, with that evidence, we held the banks accountable. We held the Australian Banking Association accountable. And the facts embarrassed these people and their entities. And then we called the insolvency practitioners before us in Canberra and in Sydney. And that put the end of it. Pauline then, in her draft recommendations from the inquiry, listed the number one recommendation of the committee, which had members of other parties on it, and that was to hold a Royal Commission into financial services. George Christensen and others, when they learned of that, went to Prime Minister Turnbull and said, "You better do it." I think George, I'm pretty sure this happened. He threatened to cross the floor. With the inquiry that we chaired coming out in favour of a Royal Commission, with George standing up and some other members I think stood up as well, Turnbull had no recourse but to call a Royal Commission into financial services. And then all of that came out in that festering couple of years with the Financial Services Royal Commission. That's how minor parties can get it done. More importantly, that's how people of Australia can stand up and get it done. These people in Parliament from the Uni Party, those who pull the strings, are susceptible to only one thing: the power of the people. Stop this misinformation, disinformation bill. Please make a submission to the Senate inquiry. You'll find it, just Google it, Senate inquiry, misinformation, disinformation bill. You'll find the relative page, and we'll post it below. Send letters. Secondly, send letters to federal members of Parliament and senators. And you've got at least a month, unless they pull a Swiftie and gag the debate and pull the reporting of the inquiry, Senate inquiry forward, which is not beyond the cards. They passed the Digital Identity Bill with no debate at all in the Senate, not even the committee stage. No questions, no amendments discussed, just voted on. So first one, submission to Senate inquiry. Second one is letters to federal members of Parliament and senators. In all your correspondence, please be respectful. Make it clear that you will be opposing them if they vote for this bill. Remind them that taxpayers pay members and senators' salaries. And remind them above all, they represent you. They serve you. Every single member of Parliament has a sworn duty to serve the people of this country, serve the people of their electorate. If the people stand up here, or when the people stand up here, this will be the first step in restoring our country. As I move around Queensland and Australia, so many people tell me the country is lost. It's not lost. This is a wonderful country. It's got enormous potential, but we have to recover it. We have to restore it. This is the first step in restoring our country. To do otherwise, to fail at this, is unthinkable. So please help us. Please help yourselves. Please help the country and every single Australian by making a submission and by writing to your federal member of parliament and your federal senator. First step in restoring our wonderful country. Thank you for listening.